My name is Brenda, and every time I say that simple sentence, I feel the weight of the journey I've taken all over again, because there's a long, complicated, and sometimes even painful story behind that name. And although I'm now, at 29, an investment manager at Silverman Sachs, and am used to my voice sounding confident and calm at meetings with serious people in expensive suits, I can't begin my story from that moment, because to understand how I ended up where I am today, I need to go back and remember how my life unfolded, starting from my childhood, when I was an unwanted child in a family where I was perceived more as a spare option, as an additional detail in an already assembled structure, than as an equal participant in the family history. I was born the fourth child, and this circumstance determined a lot, because by that time my parents already had two sons, Marcus and Jake, as well as a daughter, Sarah, and they all received their share of love, care, and even admiration, while I was born at the moment when Mom and Dad, it seemed, had already put an end to their parental mission, practically completing this long marathon. Of course, in some families it happens that the youngest child becomes a favorite, a spoiled child, who gets the most delicious pieces, and the newest toys and extra hugs. But in my case, everything turned out differently. I only got the leftovers. When Marcus needed new clothes, his parents bought them without any hesitation. When Jake needed a laptop for school, he got it instantly, as if by magic, and Sarah wanted to dance, and immediately found herself in the studio in a fluffy tutu to the applause of her relatives. And me? They would hand me Marcus's old jacket, assuring me that it still fits perfectly, or hand me Sarah's phone, the cracks in the screen deeper than my grievances at the time, or give me Jake's calculator who no longer needed it. But the worst thing was not even that, because things could be tolerated, but the lack of attention, the indifference to my small victories, that's what burned through my heart. When Marcus made the university football team, the whole family celebrated it like a national holiday, with dinner, photos, and long toasts. When Jake was accepted to the college he coveted, they held another evening of honor. When Sarah's work was displayed at a local exhibition, my parents proudly gathered relatives around, as if preparing to introduce a new star to the world. And me? When at 15 I won a state competition in mathematics, all I heard in response was a dry, "Oh, how sweet. Honey, help your sister with algebra." At that moment, I realized that the rules of this game are strict, and if I want anything, I will have to achieve everything myself, because no one will give me anything for free. By 16, I was already working after school at the local grocery store, carrying boxes, ringing up purchases, counting change, all for the minimum wage, which, however, was my own, and this feeling, holding hard-earned money in my hands for the first time, gave me more strength than any praise from my parents. The first thing I bought was a phone, not a fancy one and not an expensive one, but just new and working, not with a cracked screen, not with a broken charger, like the one I got from Sarah. My parents, of course, were happy, but their joy had a strange shade. They went around and said to their friends, "Brenda is so independent, so mature for her age," and I heard something completely different in these words. Now we don't have to worry about her anymore. When I was 18 and preparing to graduate, I already knew what was coming, because I had seen my older children go to college. I had seen my parents invest in them without hesitation, and so I was not surprised when, at the family table, my father sighed heavily and said, "Brenda, honey, we have to be honest. We've already sent 3 children to school, and we simply don't have the money to do it again." I listened and nodded, although my heart ached with pain, because I had sensed exactly this outcome long before the conversation and had saved every penny from my job at the grocery store. But still, hearing it from my parents' lips was like receiving a blow. Not because I was counting on their help, but because they said it as if it were some natural disaster and not their personal decision. Mom tried to soften it by adding, "You're so smart and hard-working. I'm sure you'll figure something out." And I just chuckled to myself, answering, "Yes, thank you for your trust, Mom." And from that moment on, I started working even harder, to the point of exhaustion. And although my grades were already good, I pushed myself to the limit because the only chance to get further was to prove to everyone and to myself that I could do it myself. I joined every club that could even slightly embellish my application and make the admissions committee believe that in front of them was not just a girl from an ordinary family, but a person with ambition and strength of character. I signed up to volunteer at an animal shelter, washed cages, walked dogs, helped with feeding, and although I returned home tired and smelling not of perfume, but of a mixture of wool and disinfectant, it seemed to me that I was finally doing something meaningful. I taught math to children from disadvantaged families in free clubs, sat with them in the evenings, explaining fractions and equations, and every time they understood something, their smiles were more valuable to me than the praise of their parents, which I never received. In essence, I purposefully molded myself into an ideal candidate for a scholarship, creating an image that at least someone could latch onto. And it worked, basically. I got a 70% scholarship to a local state university in the business program, and it was almost a miracle for me, but as often happens, the joy was not complete because there was still that 30% left, and with it, housing, food, books, transportation, and dozens of other expenses that did not add up with my salary as a cashier at a grocery store. I sat over the numbers in a notebook, adding and subtracting again and again, trying to find at least some loophole, but arithmetic was merciless. Then for the first time, I stepped over my pride and dialed the number of Aunt Linda, my father's sister, a woman who always seemed to me the complete opposite of my parents. She did not have children, but she made a career in marketing, lived in a spacious house an hour away from us, and there was always a confidence in her voice that I envied. "Aunt Linda," I said when she picked up the phone, "I'm so embarrassed, but I want to ask you for help." "I understand if it's impossible." I told her everything. The scholarship, the missing amount, my parents' refusal to even consider supporting me, my willingness to pay it back with interest if necessary. There was a pause on the other end, and all I could hear was her breathing. And then Linda said, "Brenda, I've seen your parents treat you like you were secondary to them all my life. Of course I'll help you, and you don't have to pay the money back, at least not right now. Focus on your studies." I burst into tears into the phone because for the first time in my life, someone in my family recognized my value. For the first time, I was not pushed away, but supported. Inspired, I ran downstairs to tell my parents that I had found a solution to the money issue, but that moment of joy was spoiled. They were sitting in the kitchen with Marcus, who had just graduated from an expensive private college, and a shiny new Honda Civic with a big red bow was gleaming in the driveway. "Congratulations, son, you deserve it," my dad was saying, clapping him on the shoulder, and Marcus was posing by the car, smiling for the camera. I was standing in the doorway thinking, I just paid for all my college expenses. I deserve to hear some recognition too, but no one even looked my way. In some strange mix of courage and desperation, I decided to ask. "Hey, Marcus," I said, "since you have a new car, maybe you could give me your old one." It would help me get to campus so much. He looked at me as if I'd asked him to donate an organ and chuckled. "Are you serious? I'm going to sell it and put a deposit on my apartment. Why would I just give it away?" I tried to object. "Because I'm your sister, and I helped you with your economics homework for 2 years in a row." But he just laughed. "Brenda, you can take the bus like all the other students. It might even be good for you to be patient." My parents nodded as if this was the ultimate truth. "He's right, dear," my mother added. "Public transportation builds character." I stood there silently, my heart sinking, because just a few minutes ago they had given Marcus a car worth $20,000, and they were telling me about buses and character. That night, I lay in bed and thought about how I couldn't expect anything from them anymore. No support, no understanding. I had to rely only on myself. And so I did. I worked hard in college, while other students seemed to float through life on the soft pillows of parental care. To save money, I continued to live at home, which meant taking 2 buses to campus every day, each journey taking an hour each way. but I had become accustomed to tidying up my things, adjusting myself to the circumstances, and the bus windows became my mirrors, in which I learned to see not only my fatigue, but also the strength that was growing within me. I was studying business, focusing on investment management, and while the program itself was a huge challenge, I knew it was my only chance to get to where the real life began. To pay for my books and all the necessary course materials, I took a job at a small coffee shop across from campus. The owner, an older man named Tony, was an amazingly kind and considerate person. He respected the students, adjusted to their schedules, and when the room became quiet, he would let me take out my notebooks and study right at the counter. Sometimes, when I was stuck on some difficult financial assignment, he would sit next to me, adjust his glasses, and calmly explain. Because before buying the coffee shop, he had worked in a bank for many years. "You will achieve great things, Brenda," he would say, leaning towards me as if confiding some important secret. "You have this hunger, and I can see it." And he was right. While my classmates spent the weekends at parties, I was either making coffee and wiping down tables or sitting over my textbooks until late at night. I didn't have time for that real college experience that people like to talk about, but I had clear goals, and that gave me the strength to move on. Meanwhile, changes were happening at home, and each of them only confirmed what I had long known. My role in the family had always been special, but not in the way I wanted. Marcus married his girlfriend right after graduating from college, and of course the wedding was huge, with white tents, music, a crowd of guests, and his parents paid for everything. Jake soon announced that he wanted to move out and live with his girlfriend, and his parents not only supported him, but helped him find a nice apartment and even bought furniture. Sarah moved in too, but again, with full support. And here was the irony. Even though they were all living separately, the house still belonged to them, as if they were honored guests there. Every Sunday there was a mandatory family dinner. On weekdays there were casual visits. On holidays there were noisy celebrations. And every time they entered the house, my parents lit up like a Christmas tree, and my mother said out loud, "Our beloved children are here." She said it sincerely and joyfully, not even trying to hide how she was filled with pride. And I was sitting at the kitchen table, bent over problems, solving another assignment in statistics, and this beloved children grated on my ears as if I myself did not exist in the room. And then graduation day came. 4 years of labor, sleepless nights, constant juggling of work and study. And I finally walked across the stage to receive my diploma. I already had an offer from Silverman Sachs, and many of my classmates looked at me with envy. My parents sat in the audience and clapped politely, the way you would at someone else's party, without much enthusiasm, and the feeling of alienation pierced me to the bone. 2 weeks later, they invited me to a family meeting. We were sitting in the living room, and my father cleared his throat and said, "Brenda, you're 22 now. We think it's time you found your place." I looked at him in complete bewilderment because I remembered Marcus living at home until he was 24, Jake until he was 23, Sarah until last year, and no one had ever shown them the door. "You were always more mature," my mother added with a slight smile, "more self-sufficient." I translated it instantly. "We never really cared about you, and now we didn't want to at all." They gave me 2 weeks to move out. I rented a tiny studio across town, and on moving day, I had only a rental truck with me. My parents didn't offer to help, didn't ask for my address, didn't inquire about how I was going to get settled. I unpacked the boxes in my new apartment and thought, well, this is real adult life, and I'm starting it alone again. But then it got even more painful. After I moved in, my parents stopped inviting me to family gatherings. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, birthdays, all without me. But my brothers and sisters still gathered at the house and posted photos on social media of happy faces, glasses of wine, and festive tables. On my first Thanksgiving in the new apartment, I sat alone on the narrow couch, eating Chinese noodles from a box and scrolling through Instagram, where Marcus, Jake, and Sarah happily posed next to a turkey, next to beaming parents. And at that moment, I was in so much pain that I couldn't even admit the depth of it to myself. So the next year, instead of sitting in my tiny apartment, munching cold noodles from a box and watching other people's happiness on their phone, I decided to just drive home myself. That Thanksgiving, I bought an apple pie from a nice bakery, carefully placed it in a box, and drove to my parents' house. When I walked into the house, everyone was already sitting in the dining room. Marcus and his wife, Jake with his new girlfriend, Sarah with her well-groomed boyfriend, and of course, my parents, beaming as if something incredible was happening around them. As soon as I walked through the door, the conversation died down and the air grew tense. "Oh, Brenda, we weren't expecting you," my mother said, and her voice sounded more like a reproach than a joy. "I brought pie," I said, holding up the box, as if that would explain my appearance. "That's great," my father said in a neutral tone, as if I'd handed him an old newspaper. I sat down at the table, but inside me I immediately felt like a ghost, transparent and invisible. Everyone started talking again, but not to me. They discussed Marcus's new promotion, Jake's master's program, Sarah's latest exhibition, and there was pride in every word, warmth in every look, but not for me. If anyone mentioned me, they did so with polite falseness, as if I were a neighbor who had accidentally wandered into someone else's party. "So how do you like your little apartment, Brenda?" Sarah asked with a forced smile. "Everything is fine," I answered shortly. "Still taking the bus?" Jake asked with curiosity that was more like mockery, and Marcus chuckled quietly. My parents sat nearby and seemed to be just waiting for this to be over. After dinner, I helped clear the table, thanked them for the food, and headed for the door. No one tried to stop me. No one asked when we would see each other again. That night, I finally understood. This was the last time I would show up uninvited. And you know what? They never called again after that. They never checked in on me, never asked if I was okay. I didn't call either. We all just stopped. And so the years passed. I focused on my work and built my career step by step. I got 2 promotions, paid Aunt Linda back every dollar with interest, and for the first time I saw real pride in me in her eyes. I bought myself a car, not some used wreck, but a Rolls-Royce Spectre, a car that many of my peers could only dream of, and it cost more than $150,000. I took out a mortgage and bought an apartment in the city center, spacious and bright, with windows overlooking the river. I had flown to Europe twice, walked the streets of Paris, drank coffee in Rome, and taken pictures by the canals of Venice. I was building a life, and it was a good life, real, grown up, mine. And so last week, 3 years after that disastrous Thanksgiving, I was sitting in my office at Silverman Sachs, looking through a client portfolio and marking numbers in the margins with a pencil when the phone rang. The screen said, "Mom." I picked it up and heard her familiar voice. "Brenda, your great-aunt Dorothy is coming this weekend. She wants to see the whole family together. You need to be here for dinner on Saturday at 6. "Great-aunt Dorothy?" I asked, trying to remember. Only vague memories of childhood came to mind. Birthday cards with $5 bills and ornate handwriting coming from across the country. "I don't think I can do this," I started to say, but my mother cut me off sharply. "That's not up for discussion, Brenda. She specifically asked for everyone to show up. Don't embarrass us." And without waiting for an answer, she hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand, incredulous. The audacity of it all. 3 years of absolute silence, not a single call, not a single visit, and now they were demanding that I show up and put on a happy family act for some elderly relative I barely knew or had seen since I was 12. My first instinct was to just ignore it. But then I thought about how much my life had changed since that Thanksgiving. Now I had money. Real money and success beyond their wildest dreams. And suddenly I wanted to not just show up, but show up so that every single one of them could see who I had become. I wanted to see the looks on their faces when they realized that the child they had rejected had now achieved more than all of their precious, loved ones combined. I wanted to show them the woman they had never been able to break. Yes, I was going to that dinner, and you know what? It would be fun. Saturday came and went faster than I expected, and by lunchtime I was nervously going through my dresses, pulling them out of my closet one by one, trying them on in front of the mirror and tossing them aside because I wanted to look presentable, but not so that they would think I was dressed to impress them. I finally settled on a simple black dress, understated and elegant, the fabric falling softly around my shoulders and waist, and although it cost more than most people a month's rent, to the casual eye it looked ordinary, almost modest. I added a few embellishments that looked simple but actually cost a fortune, and I liked the idea that only someone who really understood quality would notice how luxurious my choice was. When it was time to leave, I decided to park my Rolls-Royce not at my parents' house, but in the parking lot of a nearby shopping center and walk the rest of the way, because I wanted to control the moment of revelation, to direct how they would learn the truth about me. This was all a performance, and for the first time in my life, I was finally the director. Walking up the familiar street to my childhood home, I felt a strange sense of unreality, as if I was returning not to my family, but to a stage where every line had been written in advance. There were cars parked in front of the house, Marcus's neat Honda, Jake's simple Toyota, and an old scratch Subaru that probably belonged to Sarah's boyfriend. They were all modest, ordinary, and there was nothing surprising in this. My brothers and sister had always been content with little, but my parents admired them as if they were the pinnacle of success. I rang the bell and suddenly felt like a guest, a stranger who had been given an address by mistake. My father opened the door, and for a moment he looked genuinely surprised, but almost immediately he forced a smile and said, "Brenda, you did it." He pulled me into an awkward, forced embrace, more like a theatrical gesture than real warmth. Come in. Everyone is so happy to see you," he added, and I had to resist laughing in the face of his falseness. The living room was crowded, and in the center of this crowd, in my father's big chair, as if in a throne, sat my great-aunt Dorothy, tiny, gray-haired, with a face covered with wrinkles and huge glasses on her nose, through which she looked at everyone like a stern queen. She must have been in her late 80s, and she seemed almost weightless, but at the same time, the whole evening was centered around her. Marcus was there with his wife, Emma, whom I had only known from a couple of dates. Jake had brought Melissa, his latest girlfriend. Sarah had come with a guy named Derek, whose beat-up car was parked at the curb. "Look who we have here," my mother announced loudly, and there was something in her voice as if I were some random acquaintance, and not their own daughter, whom they had forced to come. Grandma Dorothy squinted at me through the glass and whispered, "Is that little Brenda? My God, how you've grown." We moved into the dining room, and I was seated at the far end of the table between Jake and Sarah, as if deliberately isolated from my parents and grandmother. Dorothy, of course, took pride of place next to Mom and Dad, and as soon as we started eating, my parents were quick to launch into their favorite self-indulgent stories. Mom was telling how Marcus had gotten a promotion at the accounting firm. Dad was proudly adding details about Jake finishing his master's in education, and both of them were almost in unison, mentioning that Sarah had recently been entered into some local art fair. "We are so proud of all our children," Mom said, beaming and turning to Great Aunt, as if they had been rehearsing it all for her. "They've done so well." Meanwhile, my brothers and sister began their usual little game of teasing me without Grandma Dorothy noticing the venom. "Brenda, I love your dress," Sarah drawled with a polite smile, her eyes sliding over the fabric with mock interest. "It's so simple, so minimalist. I guess it's fashionable now. Less is more." She wanted to humiliate me, to hint that my outfit was cheap, but I knew that the dress cost more than her monthly rent, and I even laughed at her naive attempt. "Thank you," I answered calmly and simply smiled. Jake interjected, "Hey Brenda, I noticed you walked here. Do you still take the bus everywhere?" He leaned toward me and grinned, as if sharing a funny memory. "Remember when you asked Marcus to let you borrow his old car?" he added, and burst out laughing. Marcus joined in, clapping his brother on the shoulder. "Oh yeah, I remember, and Mom and Dad said it was good for you to ride the bus as a student, to build your character," he said, and the whole group burst into laughter. And what hurt the most was that even my parents were smiling, enjoying the memory, as if it were some kind of sweet family joke, and not those humiliating years when they denied me the most basic things, while Marcus was happily bought a brand new car. I continued to smile and eat my meatloaf slowly, feeling how behind each of their taunts there increasingly emerged the very same limitations that had kept them all their lives within the narrow confines of one house, one job, one narrow world, where any other behavior seemed like a pretext for jokes. Deep down, I almost laughed, watching this picture. They were stuck where they were, and still allowed themselves to make sarcastic remarks about me, referring to events of 7 years ago as if time had stopped. Great Aunt Dorothy had been sitting quietly all this time, hardly interfering, just listening attentively and looking at everyone with her big eyes behind thick glasses. And suddenly, when everyone had almost forgotten about her presence, she turned straight to me. "Brenda, dear," she said quietly, but so that her voice was the only one heard at the table. "I've noticed that everyone is talking about your brothers and sister, but no one has mentioned you. What do you do? Where do you work?" There was a momentary, thick silence, and I felt dozens of eyes fixed on me. I put down my fork and answered calmly, "I work for an investment company, Silverman Sachs." My words sounded in the air like a stone dropped into water, and the pause that followed was so intense that I enjoyed it, watching the faces of my family change. My father's gaze froze, and I saw how he mentally processed what he had just heard. Mom's hand froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Marcus, Jake, and Sarah glanced at each other, their eyes showing confusion, as if they did not know whether to continue laughing or to remain silent. "Silverman Sachs," Grandma Dorothy repeated, and there was genuine admiration in her voice. "Well, my dear, that's quite an accomplishment. You must be doing just fine." "I'm doing just fine," I said softly, trying not to sound boastful, even though I could feel the situation turning. The rest of the dinner was awkwardly tense, with furtive glances at me as each exchange was punctuated by a series of jokes at my expense, and no one else making fun of me. My parents exchanged glances several times as if they were trying to silently agree on some sort of common course of action, but they couldn't come up with anything. Grandma Dorothy kept asking me questions about how I'd gotten into this business, what my plans were, and I could tell she was genuinely interested in my life, not in the interest of comparing, but because she really wanted to know. She remained remarkably clear, alert, and intelligent for her age, and it was her attention that was the unexpected gift of the evening. After dinner, I helped clear the table as in the old days, although everything was different. Now they did not look down on me, did not try to humiliate me, and even my simplest movements evoked a cautious respect in them, as if they were trying to understand what had changed in me. No one saw me as the family outcast anymore, and this change was palpable in the air. "Well, Grandma Dorothy," I said, looking at my watch, "everything has been wonderful, but I must go home." "I have an early morning tomorrow." She nodded and smiled. "Of course, dear, it was wonderful to see you again. You must come and visit me sometime." My parents immediately jumped up as if on command. "We'll see you out," my mother said cheerfully. "Let's get some fresh air." Of course, they wanted to accompany me, maintaining the appearance of a happy family until the very end of the evening, and so the whole group went out with me. My parents, Marcus and Emma, Jake and Melissa, Sarah and Derek. They chatted among themselves and laughed, but I saw that everyone was stealing glances at me, expecting that now, out of habit, I would head down the street to the bus stop, and it was at that moment that I felt my triumph had arrived. Instead of heading for the road, I calmly walked straight to my Rolls-Royce, which was parked in the car park. The silence that instantly fell upon the group was so thick that you could almost touch it with your hands. I pressed the button on the key fob, and a soft beep echoed through the quiet neighborhood. They all froze. I got behind the wheel, started the engine, and the soft purr of the engine only added to the effect. As I pulled up next to them on the lawn, I rolled down the window, and at that moment my father's face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and amazement. He opened his mouth, but the words took a long time to come out, and when they finally did, they came out as a mumble. This car is worth, at least, $250,000. I said calmly, as if I were talking about the most ordinary thing. My mother gasped so loudly it resembled an exclamation in the theater. Sarah paled, as if all the color had been sucked out of her. Marcus and Jake looked at each other, their faces reflecting a delicious mixture of shock, envy, and confusion, as if they were seeing me for the first time. I smiled at them all, feeling the corners of my lips involuntarily lift with inner triumph, and quietly thought, "Oh, this old lady with her feigned importance, her whole life and modest joys are nothing compared to my spacious apartment in the city center, with my rhythm of life, with a world they will never penetrate." The expressions on my relatives' faces at that moment when they suddenly realized that in front of them stood not the girl at whom one could make cheap jokes, but a woman who not only owned a $4 million car, but also her own home in the heart of the metropolis, were so priceless that I knew that I would remember them with pleasure for a long time. They all froze, pale, silent, like cast-iron statues that suddenly lost the ability to breathe. I slowly rolled up the window, turned the ignition key, and pulled away gently, taking one last look in the rearview mirror. The whole family was still standing on the lawn, motionless as statues, watching me go as if the world around them had ceased to exist for them. It was the best Saturday night in many years. On Sunday morning, I woke up surprisingly easily, with a feeling of freshness and inner uplift that I had not felt for what seemed like an eternity. I allowed myself a leisurely breakfast, made coffee, toasted bread, cut fresh fruit, and it all seemed especially delicious because I was eating not just food, but a small celebration of freedom. Then I put on my lightweight running clothes and went to Central Park for my usual run, which every Sunday helped me feel harmonious. The weather was perfect. The morning air was cool, but the sun's rays were already warming, and I still felt the electric excitement that the night before had left. About halfway through my run, my phone, hidden in my pocket, suddenly started ringing madly. First it was Mom's name, then Dad's, then Marcus, Jake, Sarah. Call after call, insistent as if I had to answer. But I just picked up my pace and, ignoring the vibration and the melody, kept running, feeling like there was a challenge in every movement. After the run, I allowed myself a little pleasure. I looked into a nice cafe near the park and ordered brunch, a fresh croissant, an omelet, and another cup of aromatic coffee. Only then did I decide to look at the phone screen. 23 missed calls and about 15 messages, all from family. I opened them and couldn't help but smile. These messages were simply hilarious. Suddenly, everyone became unusually polite, as if by magic, and showed great interest in renewing contact. Mom wrote, "Brenda, honey, we should definitely get together and talk. I'd love to see your apartment." Sarah, in her innocent way, added, "Hi, sis. I was thinking that we should hang out more often, maybe go shopping together sometime. I'd love to see your apartment." Marcus, in turn, noted, "It was so great seeing you last night. Let's have lunch sometime and talk about your work. It's very impressive." Even Jake, the one who laughed the loudest, wrote, "Brenda, I had no idea you were doing so well. We should definitely hang out more, maybe grab a coffee." And finally, a message from Dad. "Brenda, Mom and I are so proud of you. We'll be getting together for family dinner again soon." I didn't respond to any of these letters. Instead, I ordered another cup of coffee and watched the people passing by with pleasure, feeling that for the first time in my adult life, I was completely free from family pressure, from the eternal reproaches and hidden ridicule. For the first time, I belonged only to myself. 2 weeks passed, but the calls and messages did not stop. On the contrary, they became more and more desperate. My mother began leaving long voicemails about how much they missed me and how they always knew I was special. Marcus, the same pragmatic brother who always thought I was a loser, suddenly began talking about family investments and asking me for advice. Sarah, who had never shown much interest in my company, suggested going on a luxury trip together, as if it were her own desire and not an attempt to cling to my new life. I deleted all of them without answering, with a sense of mild irony and quiet pleasure. And then one evening, as I was leaving work and heading to my car, I noticed two familiar figures standing near my Rolls Royce. They were my parents. "Brenda," my mother called out, barely noticing me, "we've been waiting for you." I sighed almost imperceptibly. Great, one way or another this moment had to come. "There's a coffee shop across the street," I answered dryly. "We can talk there." We crossed the street in silence, entered a small, warm room, and settled down at a corner table. I ordered my usual latte. My parents limited themselves to plain coffee. There was silence at the table for a while, and I waited patiently for them to start talking. "Brenda," my mother finally spoke, leaning forward a little, "we want you to know how proud we are of you. You've always been so independent, so goal-oriented. We knew you'd achieve something important." I almost laughed out loud but managed to restrain myself. Only the corners of my lips twitched traitorously, because there was so much naive hypocrisy in my mother's words that it resembled a cheap play staged for an audience considered stupid. "We made some mistakes when you were younger," Mom continued, trying to speak gently, but her voice betrayed the tension. "We understand that now, but we want to make it right. We want you to be part of the family again." I didn't say a word, just sat and waited for the real reason for their sudden visit to finally be revealed, because I knew all too well that behind the mask of reconciliation, there was a request. And indeed, Mom, noticing my silence, took a deep breath and continued. "The thing is, Marcus is getting ready to propose to Emma, and they are dreaming of a beautiful, lavish wedding. And Sarah and Derek have been together for 3 years, and they will probably get engaged soon, too." So she fell silent, and Dad quickly interjected. "Weddings are very expensive, and since you are doing so well, we thought you could help. Somehow reconnect with the family." I raised an eyebrow and asked calmly, "How exactly?" Even though I knew exactly where they were going with this. My father leaned forward a little, trying to sound confidential. "Well, if you could contribute to the wedding expenses, it would really help Marcus and Sarah start a new life, and it would show that you really want to be part of our family again." I looked at them for a long time, studying every feature of their faces, and then suddenly the laughter burst out. Loud, sincere, booming, so unexpectedly bright that people at the neighboring tables turned to look at me. I wiped away the tears that this laughter caused and said, "Let's get this straight. You want me to pay for Marcus and Sarah's weddings so you can come back to the family that kicked me out, ignored me for 3 years, who didn't pay attention to my accomplishments until they found out I had money." My parents looked confused, and my mother whispered softly, "It's not like that, Brenda." But I interrupted her. "It is." I stood up, placing my napkin on the table, and continued. "You know what's funny? You always say you knew I'd be successful, but if that were true, you would have treated me differently when I was a kid. You would have supported me the way you supported Marcus, Jake, and Sarah. You would have invited me to family dinners instead of leaving me to eat Chinese takeout alone on holidays." Tears welled up in my mother's eyes, her lips trembling. "We've made mistakes, but we can fix them." I smiled coldly. "No, you can't. Because I don't want to fix them. I've spent my whole life trying to earn the love of people who never intended to give it to me. I'm done." I took my purse, slowly headed towards the exit, and didn't look back. Over the next few months, they kept calling and leaving messages, but their persistence gradually faded, and eventually they gave in. One day, Aunt Linda mentioned that Marcus had finally gotten married, and from what she said, it was a small wedding, not at all what they had dreamed of. I listened and smiled to myself, because it no longer had anything to do with me. I continued working, building my life, traveling the world. At work, I got another promotion, and with it a spacious corner office with panoramic windows that opened up to the whole of Manhattan. Soon I began dating a man named David. He worked in tech, was smart, attentive, and most importantly, genuinely appreciated my independence and success, rather than trying to use them for his own benefit. Sometimes people asked me, "Do I miss my family?" And I always answered, "No. You can't miss something you never really had." My family never saw me as a person worthy of love. To them, I was either a burden or a bank account, depending on my situation. I'm 30 years old. I live in a beautiful apartment in Manhattan, with the city lights outside my window reminding me that life is always full of new possibilities. I drive a car that most people only dream of, and I'm surrounded by people who care about me exactly as I am. I no longer need the approval of those who once abandoned me for their own convenience, and that knowledge is the greatest freedom I could ever give myself.